Hello, I'm Nicholas Tolliver. I'm here with Tyler Mraz. We are Death Drive Dialectics, and we are bringing you another video, this time on commodity fetishism. Tyler, I wanted to ask you, why is commodity fetishism so important for us to understand?
So commodity fetishism is a vast concept that touches on a lot of other concepts. I think what's most important about commodity fetishism is that to understand commodity fetishism is to demystify the way in which servitude and domination continues to thrive in our society. I feel like there's this general assumption that we live in a free democratic society, that we are free subjects willing to do whatever we want, whenever we want. Commodity fetishism is a tool for helping us locate where domination actually exists. And it helps us answer these questions that I think a lot of people have. Why are we increasingly isolated from each other, only able to relate through commodities and markets and objects? Why is production so disconnected from human needs? What is the true cost of freedom? And how does ideology function? But that being said, let's get into it. Nick, in a brief way, what is commodity fetishism?
Commodity fetishism is a concept that was developed by Karl Marx in Capital, Volume 1, to describe the ideology of commodity production and the socially constructed reality of commodities under capitalism. It describes the ideological mystification that is constitutive to the process of exchange under capitalism. And so in order for us to really understand that, we have to break down what is a commodity and what is fetishism, and how do these concepts come together. And so in terms of understanding what a commodity is, at its most basic level, a commodity is a good or a service that is produced for the market, a good that is produced to sell. So like a pair of Nike shoes that's going on the shelf, or a sweater that you get at TJ Maxx. And this is different from a sweater that it's knit by your grandmother and given to you. That's not a commodity because it's not made specifically for the market, made for you, the grandson.
Just wanted to add that it's helpful to contrast commodities to objects produced before capitalism. Like you said, commodities are things produced for a market, not for a community, not for a person, not for the Lord. Whereas in feudal times, objects were produced, crops were harvested, not for a market, but for the peasant's own reproduction, direct reproduction, or for the king, or for the baron, the person who had some sort of sovereignty over the land that the peasants were working. Key to understanding this is that commodities, markets, the exchange value takes dominance, the thing meant to be exchanged, sometimes maybe not even used.
Yeah. And while exchange and trade has always been a part of societies and different economic stages, like there was trade in feudal eras, when capitalism fully develops, commodity production becomes the dominant mode of production. So people are not primarily producing for subsistence or producing to meet communal needs, but they are producing for market, selling their labor to markets. And so let's go into like what fetishism is now, and how does fetishism as a concept connect to what we're talking about with commodity fetishism?
A lot of people are familiar with the term. You hear about various fetishes, and maybe a foot fetish or I won't get into it, but lots of different fetishes, sexual fetishes out there. But the way in which Marx uses the term and people like Slavoj Žižek, they sort of broaden the concept.
I think one way to understand what fetishism is, when we put subjective value on a particular object, when we imbue an object with values and properties that it doesn't have, we give it mystical or magical properties. If you were to think about an example of like a rain totem or like a rain god, something that you pray to in hopes that it rains, and you are imbuing that object with the property of producing rain. They can be religious artifacts or talismans, voodoo dolls, holy water.
Yeah, I think an important thing to mention too is, from our rational postmodern perspective, we tend to think of what you're describing as sort of an irrational duping. People who believe in what you're describing are ignorant. Maybe they didn't go to college. But fetishes are a constitutive aspect of being human, of being a subject. Whether you like it or not, you are fetishizing something. And it's not because you're dumb, but it's just because you're human, because you can't see everything all at once, because you can't recognize that the healing properties of holy water are actually a series of social relations that either make you feel healed or have healed you, or not recognizing that the rain that you think your totem is bringing is actually an effect of the large climate system. This inherent myopia of living that gives rise to the fetish.
An example that a lot of people understand is money, and the idea of money being a social construct. Everyone understands that money is just a piece of paper. But if I burn $100, I have burned real value because that fetish object has been imbued with value by society. And so that would be a real act of destroying value, even though it is this sort of socially constructed fetish.
There's this really interesting aspect of a fetish that, while it is this sort of spiritual, mystical, insubstantial thing, it has a real effect on our lives. And I think another good demonstration of this, and then we can move on, and perhaps this will also be demonstrative of how the fetish has transformed with the transformation of society, is objects aren't the only thing that can be fetishized. People can be fetishized too. Important fetishization, especially during feudal times, is this relationship between master and servant, or the king and his peasants. It's important to recognize that the king gets his power from everyone else recognizing that they're the king. Then the fetishization is to believe that the king is already in himself, already possessing divine power, rather than actually being given that power by everyone believing in that relation. A dialectic, if you will, of believing and acting as if the king has this inherent property of divine power, but is actually an effect of social relations.
I think the example with God is a really good example. That like humans make God, and each society makes its own God, and then worships this God and believes that this God has made them.
To a certain extent, that becomes true, that God in turn makes them. This idea is so widely accepted and has such power in society that people begin behaving accordingly. And so this sort of loop of belief and behavior begin constructing a society according to a fetish. This fetishization of people or entities loses dominance with the introduction of capitalism. We go from a fetishization of the king to a fetishization of objects. We are no longer being dominated by a sovereign. We are now citizens. We are equal subjects, especially with the French Revolution and the institution of democracy and the fall of monarchy, relations of masters and servants, and begin to fetishize objects. And this is when commodity fetishism really begins to take hold.
Yeah, I think that commodity fetishism is a misrecognition of where value comes from in the commodity. That the value of a commodity is within the commodity itself, and not a result of the labor and the social relations that produce the commodity. When you buy shoes, you don't see the sort of the factory sweatshop labor that goes into producing those shoes. You experience the value as the shoe in itself, and not the set of social production relations that produce it. And so commodity production is divorced from commodity exchange. And we are sort of left in this realm of pure exchange. And we don't see all the suffering and the exploitation that goes into the production of our commodities.
Yeah. If you go back to our description of feudal production, there's definitely a much stronger marriage between exchange and production. Farmers markets or trade, or simply producing to eat yourself, or making shoes for your family. Everything was sort of made within much more localized systems of exchange. And now you produce something for someone that you don't even know. Based on how we're talking, you might think that, again, commodity fetishism is sort of this distorted belief, a misrecognition. And it is. It is this inherent misrecognition of commodities and exchange and production. But an important thing to know and to understand is that commodity fetishism, this misrecognition, is not necessarily sustained by a lack of knowledge. It's not everyone all at once being duped. It's not an illusion that it simply exists in our head. It's the illusion by which social relations are structured. Commodity fetishism is not an effect of the individual's belief, but the sort of like radically exterior belief that we act according to, or that we act as if the commodity has an inherent property. We can learn as much as we want about the exploitative nature of commodity production, but we're still going to the market. So there's no way around it.
Commodity fetishism is a social reality of how we relate to commodities as a society. In the same way that race is a social reality based on a misconception, but that does not negate the social reality of race and its impact on people.
Yeah, I think this gets to the question of, can we be ethical consumers under capitalism? Our answer to it would be no. I mean, ethics obviously still exists under capitalism, but the very act of consumption itself is sort of already a rigged game. You know, you could go to the grocery market and have done research on where every piece of broccoli comes from, where your eggs are coming from, and make sure that you only buy from locally sourced organic products. The point of commodity fetishism is that the content of what you purchase or what you consume or what is consumed is made irrelevant in this question. It's very much a formal determination of how you are to relate with objects and how objects relate with you. I think that's just a really interesting point by Slavoj Žižek, that we don't have to believe anymore in commodity fetishism. It's that the commodities at this point are doing the believing for us. And it's not that we're believing, but it's that we're acting as if.
I think to put a finer point on that, the commodities do the believing for us. Mm-hmm. A prime example of this is advertisement. That advertisements advertise the commodity fetish of the commodity, that this commodity has these explicit values that means that we can charge you more for it. You know, that these shoes can make you run faster or have better cushion or, you know, better laces, that the value is inherent to the commodity.
I know, like, when was the last time you were really like compelled by an advertisement, or like you were convinced by an advertisement? You know, I'm sure it happens from time to time, but at this point we have such a disconnected, cynical relationship to advertisements that advertisers themselves have caught on to this and are creating self-aware advertisements. You know, yeah, we're an advertisement, we know, but still give us your money.
And I think we've been talking about commodity fetishism on the level of consumption and on the consumer side, and I think it's also important for us to talk about it on the level of production and on the production side. Commodity fetishism separates the consumer from the social relations that produce the commodity, separates them from the labor and the exploitation of what is being produced, but it also separates the laborer from the products of their labor, which is what we might call alienation, that we are not meaningfully connected to the things that we are creating for the market. And this disconnection allows for a deeper exploitation of human beings. While commodities are given life and vitality and said to possess this value, our labor is devalued and is made mechanized, and we are made to be more like machines and inputs. We are treated like numbers on spreadsheets and not like human beings.
And this has a real effect on what is produced as well. You know, at this disconnection between production and exchange, you know, who you're producing for, because you are no longer producing for yourself or your loved ones or your friends or your community, and you're producing for the market often doesn't care what people need or what people have use for. And so while there is also this alienation that's going on, that you are disconnected from the product of your labor, the effect of that, the larger long-term effect of that, is that there's a lack of food, there's a lack of healthcare, there's a lack of housing.
And no shortage of Funko Pops. That we have at the same time a total lack of housing, of essential goods and services that can coexist alongside a plethora of production of utterly useless commodities, or commodities whose use value pales in comparison to things that we could be producing.
Right. There's shores in Africa where you can't see the sand. It's just a bunch of just old shirts being produced in China, being sent to the US and just thrown away because there's just such a surplus. You might think, oh yeah, we need shirts, but the extent to which we produce shirts, I mean fast fashion, is on a scale that all of us can't even fathom. There's such a surplus of things that we need at a certain threshold, but the market has produced way beyond that. That's the case for a lot of different commodities and a lot of different objects, that so much of our labor power is going into a certain level of uselessness.
Yeah, and I think part of what commodity fetishism does is normalize this deeply abnormal process of producing purely for profit and to satisfy speculative markets of capital owners above the basic needs of real people.
And I think that's the ideological move here under capitalism, is that commodity fetishism makes it such that we desire our own domination, and it makes us desire the domination of other people. It allows us to enjoy that in these small contained objects. The exploitation, the domination, even murder and genocide is all exported and packed tightly into these objects that we can consume, like the Funko Pop, or even useful objects because they are produced for the market. Capitalism has effectively allowed us to enjoy exploitation. Even though we live in democratic, quote unquote, free society, there is a high cost to freedom. You would think any rational person, with the amount of exploitation and human suffering that's going on, there would be action, there would be solidarity, there would be radicality. A real important reason as to why none of that happens isn't because we don't know about the exploitation or we're not familiar with the amount of human suffering that's going on. This force, this drive to act as if it doesn't exist, to just go on with our lives as if it doesn't exist. And commodity fetishism is exactly what allows us to do that, to act as if all of this shit isn't happening.
Yeah, I think one thing that I don't know if Marx explicitly talks about, just the comfort that commodities provide us in our life, in a world that is dominated by capitalism, that is so lonely and so atomized, that our relationship to commodity might be one of the things that provide us comfort, whether that be collectibles or their Uber Eats, or I think everyone has an attachment to a particular commodity, even on an unconscious level. It's hard to separate yourself from.
So entrenched as we are in the commodity, our entire social relations are just a series of objects and markets. To conceptualize giving that up or sacrificing that, for me, it seems impossible. I mean,
Yeah, and let alone to make a political project around sacrifice. I think that this is a task that I don't know how you would make that work. How do you make people give up their one comfort in a world that is so deeply uncomfortable? I guess maybe the beginning of the answer lies in labor and in recognizing not oneself as consumer, but oneself as laborer, and recognizing one's place within this exploitative system and seeking to fight that exploitation and to seize the means of production of these commodities. Not that that sort of solves all of commodity fetishism, but that would be, I guess, where the fight would begin.
Yeah, I would say two things to realize is that you can't be radical solely at the level of consumption. Being a vegan, being cruelty free, you can't make a politics solely based off of that. Like you're saying, you have to focus on production, on labor. And then another thing to realize is we cannot go beyond fetishism. There will always be some sort of limit. I mean, we live in a complex society, and to a certain extent, we have to produce for a market. I'm not sure, maybe a market is needed for this level of complexity. And to that extent, there will always be a level of fetishization. But I think the point is to take more control over production for dignity, life, or social relations.
Yeah, I think the meeting of real human needs and in the ensuring that that we are creating things that are valuable and useful first, and then with whatever our excess productive capacity, making other things.
Funko Pops.
Funko Pops after housing.
Yeah, please.
Or healthcare or schools. But I think one of the really important things about this concept is that it highlights how deeply abnormal our normal is. In the grand scheme of human social relations, the way that we relate to objects, the way that we relate to the economy, is one that is deeply fetishistic, and that to an outsider is deeply alien. And so I think that's a really valuable thing, is for us to look critically at what seems so normal to us and what has been so normalized. because they are social relations, we have the power to change them.
Yeah, beautifully put.
Well, if you're here at the end, we love you deeply. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Peace.
Take care.